So let's continue with our efforts to build an image upload component. We see that this console log fired when we picked a file. Now my idea is to manage the file here inside of the image upload component to create a preview, which we have in there, but to then also of course pass it to the surrounding form, which in the end needs the file to then eventually upload it to a backend. So whenever we need to manage something, which also should update the DOM, it's of course time for a use state. So here in image upload, we definitely need use state because we will have a file which we want to manage with file and set file, which initially is undefined, but which we will of course set at some point. I will also generate another state, the preview URL, and set preview URL, which in the end, well, is the URL of this image preview which we want to generate so that we can show a preview to the user. And last but not least, I'll also add isValid and setIsValid here and use this, and initially let's say it's not valid here by initializing this state to false. So 3 states which I'm managing here. And now with that in the picked handler, it's important to know that in the event target which I logged, which is this input element, you will have a files property that holds the files the user selected. This is default JavaScript. You get that files property on the event target if that event target is a native file picker, which this one here is. So we will have the files here, and therefore we can check if this exists, if it's not undefined. So to ensure that this does not somehow get fired without the user picking a file. And I also want to ensure that file's length is not equal to 0. And of course, this should be an AND, a logical AND. So now we're ensuring that we have files, and that if we have files, we have more than one file. Actually, we could also check that it's exactly one file. There shouldn't really be a way to pick more than one here in this app. But if you would manage to do so, I certainly don't want to handle it because we only support the upload of one file at a time here. So we check whether we do have files and if it's exactly one. And if that is the case, we can continue here. Because if that is the case, I want to extract that picked file from event target files and get the first and only one. And then call set file and set it to my well-picked file, to the extracted file. I will also set isValid to true thereafter because we have a file, and then we can return to not execute any other code. Otherwise, if we don't make it into this if statement, we know we picked something wrong. Well, in this case, I want to set isValid to false here. And actually, we can remove the return statement here and instead do this in an else block, because then after the if statement, no matter into which branch we made it, we can call props on input here. So I expect to get an on input prop here on the image upload component, which should point at a function then, to which we forward the ID of this input, which we also receive through props, and this picked file if it exists. Now it does not always exist, of course. So actually let's set picked file here to be a variable and just assign a new value if we do have a file, and otherwise it will be still undefined, which is also fine here. And of course I also forward isValid. Now here it's just important to understand that when we call setIsValid, it does not immediately update this state value. Instead, it schedules this state update. So when I call on input here and I forward isValid at this point, it will still be the old isValid value. So not the new one after this update. So actually here, I will add a new variable, file isValid, which I set equal to the current state of isValid. And then here I set isValid, but again, this does not update the state immediately. So in the meantime, I will set file isValid to true here manually and set it to false here. And then just forward file isValid here at this point. So we always basically call the function we receive on input, and we always pass our picked file, but that file might sometimes be undefined if we didn't pick a valid file. And we will forward the validity information. That's my idea here. Now, this doesn't help us with the preview though. Now, I want to generate the preview whenever we got a new file. So whenever we basically updated our file state. Now, doing something upon a state change, that screams for a use effect. So here we can add use effect and register a new use effect function. This function here should trigger or should execute whenever the file changes. So we'll pass file as a dependency. Whenever we picked a new file, I want to run my logic here because in this logic, in this function here, I want to generate a preview. So first of all, I'll check if file is not undefined because maybe file changed because it now is not a file anymore, but now undefined. In this scenario, I will return. Because if we don't have a file here, there is no need to continue. We can't generate a preview URL, an image preview anyways. Otherwise, if we make it past this if check, we know we have a file. And now we can generate a image preview URL with an API that's built into the browser, the file reader. So I'll create a new file reader here and store it in a file reader constant. And again, this is baked into the browser and therefore into browser-side JavaScript. The file reader, as the name suggests, helps us read files, helps us parse files. And we can use the file reader to convert a file, which is like a binary data, into a readable or outputable image URL, you could say. Now the file reader has a bit of a clunky API, and to work with it, we have to call file reader read as data URL. Now that's not too clunky, I guess. This is in the end the command to create a URL we can output, but the problem is this does not work with a callback, this does not give us a promise. Instead, before we call read as data URL on the file reader, we have to register the onLoad function like this and execute this function, this anonymous function, whenever the file reader loads a new file or is done parsing a file, we could say. So this function will execute once this reading of the file here is done. And then in here I want to call set preview URL, but then here we also don't get the parsed file as an argument. Instead we have to extract it from file reader.result. Yeah, that's just how this API works. With that, however, we are setting a preview URL, and with that, we can use this preview URL. So down here in JSX, on the image, I now want to output the preview URL here, however, only if we have one. So let's check if we have a preview URL and only output the image if that is the case. If that's not the case, if we don't have a preview URL, I will output a paragraph where I say, please pick an image. And in addition, I also want to output an error text, which can be provided from outside, so from the component that uses the ImageUpload component, in case we picked something invalid, which should be pretty hard, but still. In this case, so if this is not valid, if isValid is false, I want to output props.error text here. With this, if we now save that and we switch to sign up here, I do have my image picker, and now I can pick this image, and here's my preview. It also crashed though. Props on input is not a function. And that makes a lot of sense, because remember that in the picked handler, I do call props on input. So I refer to the on input prop, and I expect to have a function in there which I can call. But at the moment when we use ImageUpload in the auth component, here I'm not setting this on input prop. So we need to do this. And there we now need to point at a function. And you might think that we now need to create a new function, but thankfully that's not the case. If we have a look at the on input arguments we're passing here, we see it's the ID, then the file that was picked, and then the validity of this file. Now, that is pretty similar to what we have in the input. In our input component for regular text input, we also in the end call on input at some point, and we forward the ID, the value, and whether that value is valid. Now that's exactly the same as we have here. Here I have the ID, the value, because the picked file is just the value of this control, if you will, and then the validity. So therefore, in auth, we can just bind this to input handler. So on input takes the input handler function. And in case you don't remember, the input handler function is coming from our custom form hook. Here it is. So we can manage our file, our picked image, with our form hook as well. Because the form hook, our custom form hook, does really not care about the data we're managing with it. It doesn't have to be text data. It can be a file as well. We should just make sure that whenever we switch modes, if we switch from sign up to login, we add an image key and set this to undefined. Because when we switch from login to sign up, we need to add an image key and set this to an object where the value, let's say, is null initially, not an empty string, because we're not working with strings here. Later, we'll store a file there after all. And isValid is set to false. And now this should be part of our general form validation and of our form data. Now to confirm this, in the auth submit handler, I will console log form state.inputs so that we can see whether our picked file is part of that or not. And with this, if we save all of that, switch to sign up again, and enter a valid name, valid email address, and a valid password, we see the sign up button still is not enabled. If I switch back to login, it is, but in sign up it is not, because the image hasn't been picked yet. Now if I open that picker and close it, that's still not enough. But if I now pick an image here, like this one, you see this gets enabled. And if I click here, of course, we get an error because we already have a user with that email address. At least I here in my setup already have such an error. But from our log here in line 70, we see that we have the image and the value is indeed just such a file. And we can submit this file to the backend. This will be something we have to work on. This will be possible though. So picking the image works. Now before we ensure that we also can pick an image when we create a new place, why don't we work on the backend and make sure that there we accept such a file?